This is your fortnightly instalment where I interview a trailblazing physiotherapist that has shaped the profession we are today. In celebrating their journey, knowledge and insights, you gain the opportunity to plan and guide your own professional journey. My name is Doug Carey and welcome to Physio+10. Welcome new and returning listeners to Physio+10. Today we have as our special guest Dave Hall. Dave, can we start by you just giving us a bit of a background about where you grew up and your early schooling?
Yeah, thanks, Doug. Yeah, I grew up actually in regional Victoria around the Albury-Wodonga area, so near some lovely towns like Beechworth and Yackandandah. Went to Wodonga High, then moved to Melbourne Uni at 17.
So when you moved through that period, will you say yourself you're a country kid or a metro kid?
Yeah, look, we were tree changers before it was trendy to be a tree changer. So we were known as yuppies in the valley where I grew up, where they were, farmers of 3, 4, 5 generations. But I look back at videos of myself back then. I had the broad, country northeast Victorian accent, and yeah, I was pretty much a country kid. And then moved to college. Went to St Hills College. Actually, I just got the hat on there today. At 17, it was all country kids. So really, I wasn't really growing up properly. I remember going to physio school, actually at the old Lincoln Institute in its last year before La Trobe took over in the early 90s. And yeah, the kids that I met there at physio school were some of the first occasions of meeting city kids, with a little bit of polish and a little bit of a city kind of attitude, which I wasn't used to in those days.
Your mum and dad, were they in the health sphere?
Yeah, so dad's a surgeon, and so working in the country, he was a local celebrity, waving constantly at everyone as he drives past. And mum was a nurse who sort of did medical secretary work as well. So I was always in the sort of health area, and I was really keen on sport as a kid. I used to play footy and tennis and volleyball and various other sports. So I was very much, when I started off, thinking about physio as a career at 16, and of course you've got no idea in those days what sort of possibilities there are, but very traditional in my view at that point, that I was likely to be a sports physio running onto the footy field or maybe touring with the Australian cricket team, that type of thing. So that was my first vision, but it didn't take long to change.
And just jumping back a bit, siblings, where do you fall in the family structure?
3 siblings, all sisters and all slightly younger than me. So I was the eldest in the family, and very much learning skills of facilitation as a young man, which came in handy later in life.
So then, okay, so you went to Lincoln, but what sparked your interest in physio, I guess, as opposed to becoming, a surgeon or a doctor, given that's where your dad had been?
I was definitely a sporty kid growing up around Wodonga. That's sort of how I guess I interacted with the world and how I made a lot of friends. And um, I was lucky that I was pretty good at sport. I was quite a coordinated kid, so I could pretty much turn my hand to a sport and be pretty good at it. So I became aware of physiotherapy through sport was my first thought. So that's all I'd thought of when I was initially starting. But it was pretty early in the piece in my undergraduate training that I realised there's way more possibilities than that. But as a teenager, that's all had thought of.
Yeah. Now, how'd you find that university experience?
Yeah, it was interesting. So I was at Lincoln Institute, which then, as I say, got taken over by La Trobe University. So it was a little bit political and a bit strange at that stage. It was a decrepit old building. There was a lift out the back, and that was you always took your life in your hands whenever you went up and down that. There was this thing where people would go down a floor, then press the emergency release, and it would free fall for about one floor and then suddenly stop. So that was a sort of extreme sport that we used to do at uni back in the day. And I was a college kid, so I was that classic sort of situation where I'd roll up at 7 minutes past, wearing socks or bare feet, and was very embroiled in my college life, playing sport and mucking around, like being on school camp all year round. So uni was fun, but I guess being a college kid, I was also pretty engaged with college life. But yeah, there was always struck that there's always good people at uni, sporty people, like pretty grounded sort of people at uni, and I related to most of them pretty well. But I was pretty enchanted by my school camp like life at
Lifestyle.
college as well.
Coming
Yeah.
through undergraduate, did you sort of get a feel for the area that you wanted to become involved in your sort of postgraduate phases?
Yeah, I was a bit unlucky. I failed a subject in second year, and I had to come back and repeat just that subject. So this would have been 1991. I failed a subject called therapeutic movement. I had to come back in 92, and it was only 6 hours a week. And it was pretty unsettling. I didn't know what to do. So I actually enrolled at Melbourne Uni in science and majored in psychology. So my third year, I actually did sort of created this weird double degree between psychology and physio. And to be honest, that was a real turning point for me because I suddenly saw things through a different light with all of that focus on psych. So I really enjoyed that, so I stuck with that. I did effectively a double degree from then on, but it was a bit of an unorthodox one where I was doing through La Trobe University officially. I finished my physio degree. Uh, Meanwhile, parallel to that, I was doing psychology at Melbourne Uni. So I think I always saw things from that third year onwards through a different light. And my view was that we weren't really learning enough about the psychosocial, holistic view on physio in the training that we got.
Was it a tough decision then, I guess, when you graduated from your two degrees as to whether you went down the physio or the psychology direction further?
Yeah, 100%. It was really a bit of pragmatism at the end that I just thought, well, as finishing as a physio, getting that degree, Um, by the mid 90s, by this time, I've got something, I can use it. I was keen to travel, so I went pretty much straight away after just a few months, actually. I went to the UK and did the classic, working holiday visa and locuming there in London. So I had that up my sleeve straight away. Whereas as a psychologist, if I wanted to do clinical psych, I would have had to do another 2 years of clinical experience, and there was a pathway laid out in front of me that looked a little bit at that stage a bit longer. I was actually asked by one of the teachers at Lincoln, I've forgotten her name now, but she wanted me to stay on and do a master's in Feldenkrais because I quite liked Feldenkrais, and for me that was blending some of those psychological concepts with physio. But I don't know, I was 23, 24, I sort of had my eye on travel and adventure, and physio provided a opportunity to do that. So from age 24 to 26, I based myself in the UK. I went and did Camp America and coached tennis with little rich kids down there in Florida. I did another summer looking after kids on camp in Hungary and Eastern Europe. I basically had a bit of an adventurous 2.5 years from 24 to 26. So this is 96 through to 98. And physio supported that beautifully because then I could go to London and work for a few months and earn some pretty decent cash in the locum scene down there.
It just sounds like Camp David just went on and on and on and on, didn't it?
I pretty much milked Camp David like that, pretty much till my late 30s, to be honest.
So was there anyone, were you making conscious decisions about what you were trying to further in your career, or was there anyone guiding you, or this was all very much a case of just having a good time and earning some money?
Yeah, by that stage it was. I came back and was looking around for a little bit more of a career pathway, and ended up chatting with an old lecturer, tutor gentleman by the name of Murray Hutchison, who a lot of your listeners would remember. He was always one of my favourite teachers there at Lincoln. Great guy, and he offered me a place in private practice. And it was at Hampton Park, and I misread it and thought that was Hampton down in Bayside, Melbourne. Thought that sounded pretty good. Catch the train down there. But yeah, I soon learned that it was Hampton Park, which is way out past Dandenong in the outer burbs. But I was already committed by the time I realised that. So I dedicated a couple of years sort of working under him and getting a real taste of private practice. And that was interesting, but it was never going to be for me. But I certainly sort of got my hands on and got lots of experience, and also learned a little bit around the marketing side of things with that. Um, but yeah, pretty soon into that journey, a couple of years in, I realised I think I've got a little bit more of a different career in mind here. So I started playing around a little bit more with pain management at that stage, and working at a few different places that started to take me at that stage down a more holistic path, including pain management and rehab.
Where did that lead you to?
Out of that experience, realized the power and the opportunity of working well with groups. And I realized there's a bit of a science to that. I realized there's a real skill set to that. So, as physios, we're often working one on one, but by the time you're working with groups, there is a different skill set required. I guess in particular, because I was doing pain management groups, there were people there that really felt not necessarily heard, and they were in need of acknowledgement and validation. So I started around, by this time, we're talking about sort of the early to mid noughties, I started on this pathway of facilitation skills, and I joined the Victorian Facilitation Network to really learn a little bit more about how to harness the power of groups and have group work go well. I had started also by this stage doing some Occ Health work as part of this journey of, what do I want to be? And it had some pretty mixed experiences of what it was like to run training in workplaces, and found sometimes the group dynamics was really tricky. So I was trying to get a step ahead of that. So that started a pathway towards learning about group facilitation, and there's a whole skill set there that I really found fascinating and helpful. Which culminated by the end of the noughties. I'd done a whole year of focusing on that, and had done an advanced diploma in group facilitation. Parallel to that, I'd realised that the opportunities in Occ Health Physio were pretty strong. I was particularly interested in the opportunity around injury prevention, so I'd started doing some consulting in that. So I came down to 4 days a week doing standard physio to do that. And then I came down to 3 days, down to 2 days. And so for quite a while through the noughties, I was doing 2 days of clinical work, and the rest of it was Occ Health work. So that was ergonomic assessments, risk assessment, manual handling training, wellness workshops, that type of thing.
And I think that's the first time that I met you. I enrolled in an Occ Health course in Perth, and you came across to deliver it. And I remember being an educator at the time myself, but through other pathways, and sitting down and looking around the room and going, this is different. There are some brown paper notes on the wall saying, these are our guidelines of conversation. And rather than being the old standard desks facing the front, it was just a circle of chairs. And I just sort of thought, well, regardless of what content is being delivered here today, the way in which it's being delivered is completely out of, my normal paradigm. So I found that really interesting, that you had obviously brought across that, skill set of facilitation into that environment, and you obviously found it worked quite well for you.
Yeah, absolutely. So there had been a level one Occ Health course some years prior to me getting involved with that, but it had sort of ground to a halt. And I was actually surprised, and I was digging through some old notes and realised that I'd done the Occ Health level one way back in the early noughties, and I just found my old notes and looked, and I just had completely forgotten I'd even done that course. So it was obviously when I first started being involved, and that sort of spoke something to me. I think the people that were running that course were probably highly qualified, but if I was to say that, I guess a contribution that I made towards the APA and the training routines within the APA was a greater recognition, I think, in terms of the learning experience. So it's not just about the content, but it's about how you deliver the content, and this concept around doing an activity, and getting people in pairs, sharing, and then in small groups, using interactive practical activities to encourage learning. And there's also that, a whole science around that, which I would have learnt in that facilitation training that I mentioned, and then taken into that level one. So I started running the level one around 2010 for the APA, and very much brought that into the equation, and was running that for pretty close to 10 years, right up to 2020, around that sort of time, and was quite central, I think, to that level one course getting off the ground. Initially, I would go and travel to all the different states and run it with a local colleague. So in Perth, that probably would have been Greg Borman, or people like that with good experience. Go up to Queensland and run a course with Jenny Legg, and go to New South Wales and run a course with Simon Mitchell. Here in Victoria, people like Irene, Ace, and Deb Sutherland and Harry Papagoris would come in and help us run that course, and go down to Tassie and run a course down there with Marie Weber, and go to South Australia and run a course with Richard Fuller or Martin van der Linden and all these great Occ Health physios around. Was able to sort of team up with them, and so the course benefited from all of those people, and I was very much involved in changing and manoeuvring that course over time to bring in as much of that wisdom as we could.
You've dropped off on the sort of the so-called clinical side of physio, but when you were doing that, what was the sort of a big learning curve for you with regards to being a physio? What did you find was hard about being a physio?
I've strongly believed that certainly the era that I graduated, but having run that Occ Health physio course for some time, I had a fabulous opportunity to meet a lot of physios who went through that training, and I think from what I understand, this is still has been an ongoing problem, is that I don't think we were prepared for working with people anywhere near as well as we could have been in our undergraduate course. I think we were taught a very strict sort of biomedical sort of template, if you like, and I just don't think that works very well in the real world. We sort of had this idea that you diagnose something in terms of what's physically going wrong, some sort of physical disorder, and then we from that can establish a treatment program and get them from point A to point B. But very much it was along the lines of what's physically wrong with this person. So the other aspects of what's happening with someone from a social point of view, in terms of their workplace, their financial incentives, their relationships with others, and also psychological components, so anxiety and how that impacts someone, fear, sensitivity, all the great work done by Butler and Mosley. So the work that they did was a huge influence on me, by the way, too. David Butler and Lorimer Mosley's, quite groundbreaking work around 20 years ago, which included sensitive nervous system and explained pain.
Yeah.
So I don't feel like we were. I felt like we were sort of set up to fail a little bit, to be honest. And a lot of us, including myself, kind of then quickly realised that and learned what we needed to learn. But I understand a lot of physios don't last, and part of why I think they haven't been lasting is the sudden recognition that we're not prepared for how to really work with people and get them through pain syndromes and problems that they're experiencing.
Because essentially we're dealing with a person that has a problem rather than a problem that has a person, aren't we?
Yeah, you would really only, if you're just looking at the physical components, you're only seeing a part of the picture each time. You really need to look at all those things, physical, social, and psychological, as all part of the melting pot of what's got them to that place and what's going to get them out of that place.
Yeah. And that's the challenge as a clinician, is to try and work out, of those different spheres of influence, what's probably the biggest for that particular person. And it doesn't stay static, does it? It does change. That person moves along their pathway.
Absolutely. And I think that was a great insight for me, and I'm sure that others have had a lot of aha moments along the way. At a personal level, then that was heading me further towards pain management as a focus, if you like, for my career. But as I mentioned, I was also interested in Occ Health for other reasons, and that was more sort of looking at something that suited my lifestyle. I always wanted to be a dad, and I didn't want to be one of those dads that would head off to work at 8 in the morning, come back at 6, and that was my life. I wanted to be one of those dads that would 30, be around either side of that and be extremely hands-on. And I saw the Occ Health work as an opportunity of supporting that. And that's really how it's played out. So that's been, something I looked at down the future and thought, I think I can earn enough money and be in, still have enough time up my sleeve to be super involved and be one of those kind of super dads, which is harder said than done.
But obviously it worked out okay. Hey,
I certainly try.
The other time that we caught up was at the Adelaide conference. I think it was about 2019. and you were handing out headsets. Now, this is when we
Mhm.
move into a bit of an area where I guess you are, again, quite groundbreaking in what you've been doing. Can you tell us a bit about how you got into what you call disco physio and how that ties up in and around your career?
Yeah, so we've got that, start with pretty standard physio, move into pain management. That gets me interested in facilitation. I then graduate as a facilitator. Now, that sent me, as well as being in the physio world, sent me into a whole different world. So I was a graduate of a course in facilitation that then had me rubbing shoulders with other facilitators. So that's been a fascinating world for me to be a part of. And as part of that sort of world of facilitators that I've been lucky enough to be involved in, part of that was meeting a gentleman named David Naylor who invented this concept of silent disco. Now, that had been around for a while, but bringing silent disco into the streets, so into public spaces. And I loved it. Parallel to physio, just at a personal level, I loved dancing and was always looking for opportunities to do that. So this brought this sort of love into something that I could then do, and get paid for. So the concept there is wear headphones, not dissimilar to what I'm wearing now. They're wireless headphones, and doing like parties and place activation out in the street. So this was diverting away from physio and creating, something that I would have happily done just as fun, but doing it professionally, getting paid to do it. So that spawned out of that sort of facilitation world that I found myself in. So I guess then for some years running parallel, I've had this, Dave the physio and still focused on the Occ health side of things, and fairly serious hat there, the ergonomics, risk assessments, manual handling training, and trying to look a bit, bit profesh and pulling it off most of the time. And then parallel to that, this zany character, Disco Duk Duk. Silent disco. You can see in my background there, that's me and my colleagues. I'm the guy in yellow in the back corner there.
Yeah.
So
Disco Duck
yeah,
Duck.
and this is me at Adelaide Fringe. You can see here. So yeah, this was a whole different world and very entertaining and very much fun, keeping me fit, all of those things. And then recently you mentioned disco physio. So when the pandemic hit a couple of years ago, and I was searching for some different ways to make an income, and some of my main ways of making income were severely restricted. I blurred the two into this exercise class called Disco Physio. So that's an example of something where I'm blurring those two worlds.
Can you give us an outline as to how that works, the disco physio now?
Yeah, so it's an outdoor class in headphones. Very much like it's a 45-minute class that a lot of physios would recognise. There's a warm up and a cool down. We use TheraBands, so we're trying to get a good mix of core strength and cardio, flexibility, all the tick boxes that we know are important in a general exercise class. But the soundtrack to it all is ridiculous, and it's all disco music. And I've also got really lovely loyalty with a group of people now. So the demographic for that are mostly middle-aged people, mostly women, disco tragics like myself. And because there's a real regularity now too, we can get pretty silly. So we do it in parkland, and there's bushland not far from where we are, and we go into the bush and jump out and surprise each other from behind trees, and it just gets silly. So the silent disco work, by definition, is very silly. We're always doing flash mob dances and going into cafes and suddenly popping up behind people and all sorts of flash mob ridiculousness. So I'm slowly bringing some of that into the physio class, and they love it. It's because it breaks them out of their head and gets them laughing and being silly on a Saturday morning. But it's still a class. It's still ticking those boxes, still getting you stretching, your groundedness, getting your flexibility, getting your core strength. I love using TheraBands, always have. But it's also to a crazy soundtrack.
And more importantly, they're having fun.
Yeah, yeah. No, so
Significant
it's been,
serotonin overloads.
yeah, it's been great fun.
Can you, looking back across your professional career so far, what would be three highlights for you that were either highlights or turning points in the way you approached your profession?
Yeah, I think just getting involved with the APA, which was from 2009 onwards, was great because I think I was probably at a risk at that point of moving away from physio because I was really very engaged with my facilitation work. But then I realised when I got heavily involved in the APA, so that I was initially the Victorian chair of the Occ Health Physio group, which then got me able to be involved with revamping and breathing back to life that level one course. And I think that was terrific because it gave me an opportunity to take that skill set and bring it into the physiotherapy world. And I think that was appreciated. I think that was needed, and I really enjoyed it. So that it gave me a new lease on of interest in physio and the training programs we could run within physio. So I'd nominate that. You wanted three altogether?
Oh, look, it's up to you. You can go for 10 if you want.
I did. I have really enjoyed bringing disco and physio together. This is much more recent. This is in the last couple of years. So disco physio I would nominate in there too. Um, just bringing those worlds together and seeing how successful that's been at a local level. So my next stage is to see if there's a bit of traction to bring that into my corporate clients. It's an interesting journey that where you do wear different hats, and it's kind of been easy in some ways to have the professional Occ Health physio hat over here, slightly separate to the zany disco character that I've also had parallel with that. So I think there's a leap of faith, and to be honest, a little bit of anxiety, but I'm sort of okay with it to blend those two into disco physio as a thing. It feels a bit vulnerable sometimes, but mostly it feels exciting.
I guess that, in talking with different people on Physio+10, that's probably something that's happened with a lot of them, that sometimes it's just been a pathway that's developed almost unconsciously. But I suspect for some, because they have been little leaders in different niches, they've gone into an area that they've had an interest or something's happened, they've moved in towards that, and they've used their base skills of anatomy and physiology and biomechanics and all that sort of stuff, and they've moved into this niche and they've been able to apply it. You've almost come the other way. You've come from your facilitation side of it and you brought that back into physiotherapy and, made physiotherapy better because of that. So yeah, I can understand it would be, is this going to be accepting? Is this going to be seen as being, unorthodox, because physio by and large is quite orthodox and mainstream. So to bring in, a colourful flash screen and yellow uniform with headphones and silent disco is probably something which most you could perceive as being a little bit out there and therefore not acceptable. Because I think sometimes we need to loosen our belts a bit in physio and be a bit more accepting of different ideas because they are often quite complementary and helpful.
Yeah, and if it's okay with you, I might just jump onto that a little bit and talk a bit around anxiety and the journey I've had with that, because I think that might be of interest to your leaders. So, because I have done a lot of presenting, often in front of big groups, run a lot of courses. A lot of what I've done has been that sort of being the facilitator or being the trainer. And then, of course, separate, we've talked about the silent disco where there's often big crowds and big energy. I think there's been an assumption that that's easy for me to do and that that's something that comes natural. The reality is it's extremely hard for me to do. I've always had an issue with anxiety. I was a really shy kid, and those that remember me at uni, I was still really shy even into my 20s. So I really just learned a way of managing that. But the reality is I still get extremely anxious in front of big groups. But look, I've just turned 50, so I've probably got to a stage where I know it, I accept it, I still feel it. And I feel my tension and everything build just before gigs and all that sort of thing. But I guess I was sort of facing two options. I was facing a pretty stock standard career, stock standard life where I have to really work really long hours to earn as much money as I wanted to and battle away. Or I had an opportunity to sort of feel the fear and do it anyway, if I can put it that way, and have a go at these things. But I did want to just make the point that it's not been an easy thing to do, and it still is anxiety producing for me all the time.
Thanks for sharing that. Like, that's pretty, that's very nice of you to let us know that. Do you also sort of feel that your life, however, has been more enriched because you've taken on that anxiety and gone down that pathway that's not been quite as easy for you?
Yeah, 100%. And that's why I wanted to share that because I think it's a real barrier. I think anxiety, feeling silly in front of people, being exposed, being vulnerable is a real barrier to people trying different things, trying new things. And I get it, and I know that feeling, and it restricted me a lot in my youth, and it still restricts me a little bit now, but I really made some decisions around just being willing to push through that. And it did take a little bit of a personal sacrifice and continues to, just in terms of that sort of stress responses that I would get, the shortness of breath and the muscle tensions and all the things that we associate with stress. I have suffered quite a lot of that, quite a lot of neck pain and whatnot that's been associated with just being nervous that things aren't going to go well, that I'm going to try something that I'm going to get them. You talked about the course that I'd get people sitting and talking and no one would do it, or that one person would always be dominating and I wouldn't be able to sort of manage it. Every sort of thing that I tried that was slightly different from the norm was a real challenge to me, but I just thought it was worth persisting and working with that challenge.
Is there anything you'd like to share that helps you as an individual get over or manage that anxiety that other people could maybe consider?
Yeah, so definitely, I think with your working schedule, I feel like a lot of people are really addicted to being very, very busy. We talked before we started the podcast about how my day was looking and how your day was looking, and I've always thought, Doug, you're a good example of someone who balances your work with your other hats that you wear and your life. And I've always done that, and I think that makes a big difference. Today, I've been down at the pool with a friend of mine, not doing laps, just in the steam room and just moving between there. And that's Melbourne in August, so Um, and then I went and we've just been engraving my son's soccer team awards. Just doing some fine motor skills with that. Grabbed some lunch down at a local cafe, and so that's all in lieu of the fact that tonight I'll be running some silent discos at the winter market, and that's going to be intense. From 5:30 p.m. right through till 10. So I think what we need to be on the front foot with being looking after ourselves, managing our energy. So that's one tip. The other thing I've learned is that being a worrier and a thinker and someone who really wants things to go well, to schedule in the prep time ahead of situations that will need that. So if I was running a 2-day level 1 course, I would put aside a few days before that, half a day or a day, to go there mentally, prep what I'm going to do, get all my um, all the sort of training tools that I needed ready, the whiteboards, the butcher's paper, pre-write some of the agreements we're going to look at. So preparing helped manage the anxiety. You can overdo that. There is a balance between preparing and being willing to go with the flow, but some level of prep can certainly help with that. I've also been someone who's been tried to be very open about that, worked with therapists over the years on it, on and off, depending on how I'm going. But I've had a lot of good close friendships that kind of work a little bit like therapy as well, where I talk about this stuff and talk about it with my partner and whatnot. And I'm very much a believer in just being open in our conversations about anxiety and pain and the sort of things that make life harder for us. So that's a few tips that come to mind.
Yeah, thanks. If you could step back to your younger self, are there any pieces of advice you'd sort of like to pass on to a young Dave Hall stepping out into the world of physio?
Oh my gosh, we'd do so many things differently, wouldn't we? This is the thing. Like, we have to respect the journey. I think if we don't respect the journey we've taken, we can fall into remorse and we can fall into regret. But the reality is that a 50-year-old Dave would do a million things different than what a 16-year-old Dave saw coming at the time. So I think the journey's been great. But of course, the main thing I'd say is just don't be scared. Just have a go at it. That the repercussions of failing are way less relevant than just not having a go at stuff. And I did eventually learn that, but I think I learned that a bit later in life than I would like to. So I would certainly say have a go. I would say, don't be afraid to give things your own unique voice and your own unique take. Um, don't be wedded to working full time or earning huge amounts of money. Try and just earn a manageable amount of money and be willing to sort of look after yourself and do live your life. So that's a starting point.
Yeah. And looking forward, like where do you see yourself, or what do you want to be doing in the next few years as a professional? I won't say a physio because that may be too restrictive.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that. Like, I've got the three titles at the moment: facilitator, physio, and entertainer. So I'm 50 now. I've got another 15, 20 years of really focusing on those, and I think that the amounts of those would vary. It is great to have different hats. As I get a bit older, I might not be physically able to do quite as much of the sort of physical work as what I can do now. Not very restricted at the moment. So it's great to keep up my Occ Health physio work that I do. I've done that for a lot of years now, so that's great to have that skill set as well. I was just doing all risk assessment work yesterday out in Geelong. It is nice to have work like that where I have literally zero anxiety because I've done that for quite a while, and it's not to say it's easy. It's always challenging, but it's certainly quite familiar. But to mix that with the disco physio, with the silent disco stuff, I'm also working at the moment with a friend on a project which is non-physio related, but using silent disco technology, where we create turn historical stories into interactive theatre experiences. So hopefully that'll be something that gets some traction. So yeah, those three titles of facilitator, physio, and entertainer. There's lots of interesting projects within those three, and life is short, and I've hit 50 already. I'm well over the halfway mark, so I'm very much keen on living my life and creating my story.
Yeah. From my perspective, you're still a young bunny, so don't worry about 50. So
Yeah.
looking forward, where do you see, or where would you like to see our profession of physiotherapy going?
Yeah, well, I'm hoping that there's a greater understanding about. We talked about that sort of psychological and social component to health, and that physios are on the front foot with that. I'd like to see that progress, so that we really understand that. I think we'll be better therapists if we can. I think there's an opportunity to be more creative and do more creative takes on physical exercise, which obviously disco physio is an opportunity to do. I often find I'd still go to the conferences every year. I'll be going to the conference in a month from now in Melbourne. I still find they're a little bit painted with an bit of an old brush, like person behind the lectern up the front with PowerPoint and whatnot. I would love to see conferences and training be more three-dimensional and more interactive than that. I think the APA training still feels like it's sort of embedded in what to me is a little bit of an old template and an old paradigm. So I'd love to see more interactive opportunities for networking and learning. So that's probably a good start.
Cool. Dave, you're a fun-loving guy, and it's really good to catch up with you again and dive a bit deeper into all the things that you have been doing. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what you do develop and build on over the next few years, because I'm sure it's going to be pretty interesting and exciting. So thanks for joining us and explaining your story on Physio+10.
Great. Thanks, Doug. Great to connect with you again, and all the best.
Thank you very much. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Physio+10. in which I trust you gain some valuable insights. It'd be awesome if you could leave your 2 cents worth as a review or rating of this podcast, and I look forward to sharing the story of another trailblazing physiotherapist with you in 2 weeks' time. Stay safe, bye for now.